I was out at the gym one night, and I came home, and my sister, who I was living with at that time, was watching wrestling with her boyfriend. They were like making out on the sofa and weren't paying attention to what was on TV, right? 'Cause she wasn't a real big wrestling fan either. But they were busy, and so I walked in the door, and I busted them and looked over, and I went, "Oh my God, not only are you making out, but you're watching wrestling. What are you doing? What is this?" And I started watching it, and it amused me in the sense that, and I didn't even really look at it physically, but I was like, each person was such a character, and there was lights and people clapping and screaming and booing and these crazy outfits and these crazy situations all in one night.
Right.
And then I was like, I don't know anything about this, but this is me. I could fit into this, and that's how I decided that that's what I was going to do.
So how did you get hooked up with Killer Kowalski, and what was training like?
So after I had decided that was going to be my career path, not knowing anything about it, of course, not understanding what as a female and what that look and presence was, it was just okay, that's what I'm going to do.
Right.
So first thing I had to do was find a wrestling teacher. Right, where do these people come from? How do they get in the business? Well, as we know, most of this is a generation-oriented business, or it's a very small niche. It's a very small group, so I started asking around. I went to boxing gyms, regular gym, different gyms, and said, anybody that teaches wrestling, just like it was like off the tip of my tongue, like it would be a normal thing to go have a wrestling school on your local corner or something. I didn't know, and people were like, I don't have a clue what you're talking about. And then I started going to calling boxing gyms and going to boxing gyms, and of course they were psyched because I thought I was going to be this great female boxer, and I was like, no, I'm looking to do wrestling, and I never got any response. And I started hearing one of these boxing promoters that I had run into said, Joni, I think that there's a guy named Kowalski who was a big wrestler, and I think he lives in Massachusetts. And I was like, okay, but nobody knows where he is. Nobody knows about him. But that's what I heard. And so I actually literally went and picked up the phone book, and I looked under Kowalski, because I figured, how many Kowalskis could there possibly be?
Right.
And there was one, and I called the number, and it was like 11 o'clock at night or something ridiculous. Of course, I'm a night owl, always have been. Thinking nothing of it, I picked up the phone, called him up, and I said, is this Mr. Kowalski? And he said, yeah, what of it? This grumpy, grouchy old geezer. And I said, my name is Joni. Somebody said that you lived near me, and I want to learn how to wrestle. And he said, told me where he was in Tewksbury, Massachusetts. I lived about almost 2 hours away. It would take me to get there. And he said, show up with $2,000 cash. Here's where I am. I hung up the phone. And I went, well, I worked my buns off for months and months, and I saved. I babysat.
Right.
I was working. I was working at yogurt shops. I did sing telegrams. I was the freak on wheels, and I saved that $2,000 to go be more of a freak on wheels and walk into that school, which was an experience of itself. I walked into an old, rickety gymnasium, and I said gymnasium not because there were weights in there. It was a completely bare room with mirrors on one side and a hardwood floor with a ring in the middle.
Right.
But it was a ring with crappy ropes and about 10 steel beams underneath it. And I saw maybe about 5 guys that were there who were playing wrestling house, if you will. And they were jumping off for the ropes and doing Shawn Michaels arm drops and like, I don't know what they were doing, but jumping all over each other and, you know, basically beating each other up without them knowing what they were doing. And there's this guy sitting like humped over, like I referred to him as he reminded me kind of like a walking shrimp. He had this, hair piece on, and you could see the rubber sticking out,
right.
And he'd go like this every once in a while, and he just looked over at me like that, and I was like, what am I doing? Of course, here I am, like, I'd already developed pretty nicely, I was pretty fit. And so in I walked in, and he went like that, and then did the double take, and went, oh my God.
Money.
Sure. Well, yes. And I said, are you Mr. Kowalski? And he said yes, and I said, it's $2,000. I want to be a wrestler.
Right.
And the odd thing was that I went 3 times a week and once on the weekend. And once I was in the ring doing a couple of things, I learned how to do kind of just fall or flip over somebody and land on these steel beams. And so the first time I did that, and it knocked the wind out of me, and did a drop toe hold and broke my nose. It's not stuff that he ever really taught. It was kind of figuring it out for yourself. And,
right.
And then I became a little more cautious, and I still went, but I didn't get in the middle of the mix. I stayed outside the ring, and I watched. And I watched everybody else who I knew would never make it, and they'll hate me for that, but there was a reason why I ended up there and went that path, and there was a reason why I went and watched, because I knew that I was going to do it.
Was Perry Saturn in the class at that time?
He was not. He had made a couple of appearances, so I did meet Perry. He had real long hair.
Yeah,
yeah, and I remember him making an appearance one time, just stopping in to talk to Kowalski about something, and the boys were going. Of course, I wasn't really friends with a lot of them. I probably recognized their names if they said, I went to school with her, but it was very much out of the mix.
Right.
I stayed on the outside, and I didn't want to get in the rough of things.
Were you ever discouraged at all about the business? Did you say, maybe this is not me, when you're, learning the bumping and stuff like that?
No, I didn't. I didn't. No, I never once thought that. I should have. Realistically, I really think I should have. But I think, my lifestyle, the way it was, and I had a goal in mind. And also, for me at that time, there was no such thing as pain. You know what I mean? So you learn to deal with that, and that's what you have to do to make it.
What about learning the psychology? I guess that came over time in the ring in front of people. You would learn the psychology and stuff like that.
I guess the point of learning and how you get into it is twofold. And one, that is that although I didn't technically learn, it was a very good question when you asked, did you think at that time? No, because I didn't know any different than what was put in front of me then. I wasn't in the real deal yet. But I think it was integral as far as, most people who would walk into that and not really be taught and slam themselves around would kind of know if they're going to continue that or not. So it's kind of like a discipline.
Right.
You know, you can go to school for something and do something completely different than what you graduated in, but you know that an education is worth discipline, and can you hack it? But it wasn't until I was hired, and without Kowalski's knowledge, to this day, Kowalski will say he got me into the business. And you know what? I'll say, yeah, maybe he did, because he's the first one I called, and he's the first. That was a part of the whole process. But I would make my own videos, and I would go to as many shows as I could to start learning, to start watching,
right,
and see what they did and what kind of production it was, and started watching it on TV and really learning instead of just jumping into it. I was trying to see.
You're a student of the game.
Right. Exactly. And therefore, I was talking about it and going to school and whatnot. I was taking pictures. I started doing independent matches for some first, not knowing what I'm doing.
Right.
I was wrestled for Moolah. They started hearing about me, and the real wrestled Debbie Combs in like a basement on a mat.
Right.
Like Liz Chase, and stuff that I look back on now and I go, it's just really seedy, hard stuff, But like I said, I didn't know any different, and that was really cool to me. And I knew that I was good because it was not like I was fighting it. And I didn't know who these people were that I was wrestling on
right,
these independent circuits. But I think that I was there kind of to take a beating and learn, but it didn't end up that way. I was learning, and I was actually doing good.
Right.
So people started hearing about me kind of on the underground circuit, and I would travel. I would get in my car and would travel down to Florida in a beat up car. I would travel to the Carolinas, and it was so dangerous. So I look back, you never know who you're with or what could have happened, It's crazy, but I was doing it, and I ended up meeting some of, how would I say this politically correct, because they're all were stars in my eyes, but I would say some of the lower guys rather than some of the top guys.
Right.
You know what I mean? Of course.
In New York, you're talking about?
People only knew in the WWF, right, then later on, but they're all equally as special. Sometimes it's the opposite,